The house felt colder that evening, though the heater hummed softly in the background as though opposing the creeping chill I sensed deep inside. I sat in my late husband's old armchair, the leather cracked and familiar beneath my fingertips, surrounded by whispers of a time when this was my home in every sense of the word, the center where our family gathered, where decisions were made, and where my voice had once carried weight. Now, the rooms echoed with silence that was deafening. My son and his wife moved through the house like shadows, speaking in low tones about the business, my family's legacy, all without a thought to include me. A dull ache settled in my chest. I was present, yet invisible. It was as if I were a ghost tethered to memories, watching them talk around me, absenting me with their murmurs. That evening, the family dinner was no different. We sat at the long oak table, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier's soft light, but the warmth that once blessed our meals had drained away. Conversation dodged me as effortlessly as the cold winter wind dances through barren trees. My comments, when I mustered the courage to offer one, were brushed aside, dismissed with an easy, unspoken consensus that my thoughts were relics from a bygone era, no longer pertinent. Michael, sitting opposite me with his usual confident tilt of the chin, was the first to strike the blow. His voice cut through the shallow chatter with a sharpness I had felt before, but never so openly expressed. "Mom," he said, his eyes barely meeting mine, "some of your ideas about the company are outdated. The market's moved on and so have we. You should consider that." His words fell like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of stunned silence across the table. I held my breath, fighting against the sudden prickling tears behind my eyes. But before they could dare to fall, Clara, with that same sly smile she wore like armor, leaned forward and added her own dagger, as if choreographed. "Evelyn," she said sweetly, though venom lurked beneath, "it's clear you don't understand the new direction. Maybe it's time to let those of us with the energy and vision take the reins. It's for the good of the family business and the future." The words echoed inside me, sharp and cold. They didn't only question my relevance. They condemned my very existence in the spaces I once ruled. I could feel my voice dissolving inside my throat, swallowed by the betrayal that rose like a tide. In that moment, something inside me cracked but did not break. I thought of my late husband, Henry, his steady gaze, his quiet strength that had anchored our family for decades. I could still hear his voice, tender yet resolute, whispering secrets during those long nights when only the moon witnessed our talks. One memory returned with vivid clarity, a time years ago when he pulled me aside after a long day, his face marked by fatigue but shining with trust. "Evelyn," he had said, clutching my hand as if it were the only thing holding him upright, "the shares I hold in the business, they are more than just ownership. They are keys to our family's future. They must never fall into careless hands. Promise me you will guard them, even when I am gone." At the time, I had nodded dutifully, not fully understanding the weight of his words. Now, sitting quietly among the ruins of my family's gathering, the full gravity settled upon me like a cloak. They believed I was powerless, that the past was my only place, that my influence had faded with Henry's passing. But in their underestimation lay a mistake far greater than any I could have imagined. That night, I remained seated long after the others left the table, my fingers absent-mindedly tracing the wood grain as my mind turned over every slight, every cold glance, every whispered exclusion. The familiar bitterness of invisibility stung fiercely, but beneath it stirred a new resolve, small yet fierce. They thought I was forgotten. They thought my silence meant surrender. They were wrong. I would not be pushed aside, nor would I allow the legacy Henry and I built to be handed over to those who lacked the respect, the patience, and the understanding to steward it wisely. As the house grew quiet, the weight of betrayal solidified into clarity. The injury was not physical, but far deeper, piercing the soul with the cruel realization that the people you love could so easily cast you out when the burden no longer suited their convenience. Yet, as I sat back in the aged armchair that had witnessed years of laughter, tears, and secrets, I inhaled slowly and deliberately. This was my home, my family, and my fight. The night bore witness as I made a quiet vow to myself, a promise sealed within the silence. I would rise from this injury, stronger and more resolved, not through loud confrontation, but with the quiet authority of a matriarch who had been underestimated for far too long. In the solitude of that night, the silence around me was not empty, it was filled with the echoes of years I had poured into this family and its business, often without recognition or gratitude. I thought back to so many moments blurred by time, moments where I had been present but unseen, when my voice had been reduced to a mere background hum as others spoke over me. Those long discussions at the dining table where I sat quietly, offering insight that was nodded at but never truly considered. It was as if my opinions were shadows cast on the wall, visible but intangible, disregarded simply because I carried no official title. The pain of those memories carried weight, heavier than any wound visible to the eye. Yet within them, a strange clarity began to bloom, sharp and undeniable. The realization that my silence and their dismissal had sheltered something powerful. My years of quiet support had built a foundation stronger than they dared imagine. I had cultivated knowledge, patience, and an understanding that went beyond the surface disagreements and loud claims. I knew the ebb and flow of the family business, the loyal employees who depended on it, the contracts carefully negotiated, the finances quietly monitored. My sacrifices, often invisible, had bought me something no one else seemed to grasp: insight wrapped in silence. While they had raced forward, blinded by entitlement and greed, I had watched, listened, and learned. I had waited, preparing without them knowing, for a moment that now felt within reach. I recalled the countless times I had held myself back, letting Michael take the spotlight at meetings, letting Clara control the conversations because it seemed easier to keep the peace than to fight a losing battle. I had stayed in the background, believing that patience was my virtue, that love for my son and the family should overcome their disregard for me. But love had become a burden I carried in quiet solitude, and it was time to convert that burden into strength. Tears welled in my eyes then, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were the tempered residue of years of endurance, the silent release of pain transformed into resolve. I breathed deeply and let the memories wash over me, every dismissive glance, every course of silent suffering, every overlooked contribution. Each one was a stone laid on a path, one I now intended to walk with purpose. I thought of the lawyer who had once gently warned me about neglecting the legal documents tied to the business. How I had brushed aside her advice out of a sense of loyalty and fear of conflict. But that fear had been misplaced. It was not confrontation that threatened the family, but silence, my silence. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit that it was not only their betrayal that hurt me but my own hesitation to confront it sooner. The years of quiet endurance had been the prelude, but now the curtain was rising on a new act, one where I would no longer be sidelined but where I would take the stage with deliberate grace. I poured another cup of tea, its warmth a small comfort against the seeping cold within. The house was still, except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock, a sound that seemed to mark not just the passing of time, but the changing of tides. I returned to the stack of family papers that had been gathering dust on my desk, their contents more significant than any had guessed. Beneath layers of reports and letters, I had uncovered the subtle weaknesses in the business management decisions made too rashly, expenses unnoticed, debts quietly growing. These were the vulnerabilities Michael and Clara had ignored in their pursuit of quick success, confident that their inheritance was their birthright. The weight of these realizations settled with purpose, kindling a sense of justice beyond personal hurt. This was no longer about being hurt or sidelined. It was about protecting a legacy they were blindly dismantling. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. To confront my own son and the woman who had become my adversary meant navigating a battle they would not expect from a woman they deemed outdated and weak. They would dismiss me again, underestimate my ability to act, just as they had before. But I was changed now. The quiet woman who once wore her patience as a shield was ready to use it as a weapon. I spent the night reviewing every detail, tracing every misstep, every overlooked contract, every questionable expense. My mind, once clouded by hurt, now focused like a laser. I visualized how I would move forward not with anger, but with the measured precision of someone who knew their territory intimately. I would need allies, careful plans, and an unshakable calm. I reflected on my quiet nature, my lifelong ability to observe and understand without drawing unnecessary attention. It was a gift now, a strategy. They thought silence was surrender. It was the opposite. This night became a turning point. I acknowledged the depth of the pain I had carried, but more importantly, I embraced the strength it had forged within me. This was not a moment for loud declarations but for thoughtful, deliberate action. I allowed myself a brief smile in the mirror, tired but resolute. Evelyn Harper was no longer the invisible figure waiting in the wings. She was the matriarch awakening from silence, ready to reclaim her place. And she would do so without fanfare, without drama, only the steady, unyielding tide of quiet authority. With dawn approaching, I settled into planning the first steps of a careful, unassuming resurgence. They had taken too much for granted, and soon they would learn that the heart of this family and the keys to its future had never left my hands. The silence of the night no longer felt like a cage but a forge where my resolve had been tempered. I welcomed the coming days with a calm that belied the fire burning inside. There was pain, yes, but also purpose, an inspiring life lesson carved in silence and quiet strength. I was ready to move not with anger, but with justice. Not with noise, but with steady, unshakable will. This was my time. The time to turn their betrayal into my power and usher in a new chapter where the matriarch ruled silent, sure, and unstoppable. The morning light spilled gently into Henry's study, casting long shadows across the polished wood and rows of neatly shelved books, a sanctuary of knowledge and quiet power that I had barely dared to enter in recent years. Yet today, it felt like the right place to begin. The scent of aged leather, faint hints of old ink, and the familiarity of well-worn papers surrounded me, placing me firmly in a past where the family's future had been carefully constructed. With deliberate care, I opened folders and leafed through documents long neglected. Financial statements, contracts, correspondence, each page a thread in a complex tapestry I had only glimpsed from the sidelines. Suddenly, the fragility beneath Michael and Clara's confident veneer was glaringly visible. There were hurried decisions with little explanation, payments delayed to reckless extremes, and investments made without any thoughtful risk analysis. I realized they had rushed headlong into leadership, blinded by entitlement, without the experience or respect to manage the legacy properly. But amid the chaos lay the truth that Henry had entrusted me with the most important part of this whole enterprise. I controlled the majority of the shares. The papers confirmed it. Quietly and without fanfare, I held the power they thought was lost, the keys to the kingdom they believed they'd inherited. The irony stung, but it also cast a spotlight on my path forward. It was not vengeance I sought, but rightful stewardship, justice for a legacy risking collapse due to arrogance and ignorance. This truth gave me a calm not brash or loud, but resolute and measured. It was the foundation for a plan that would unfold with patience, cleverness, and unshakable resolve. I needed a trusted ally, someone who understood not only the family business but the delicate intersection of family, loyalty, and law. Diane Miller came to mind immediately, an advisor to Henry and a pillar of quiet strength through the years. I called her, my voice steady beneath the undercurrent of fierce determination. When we met in her office the next day, I brought the dossier of documents and quietly laid out everything I had uncovered. Diane, ever pragmatic, confirmed my concerns and added her own sharp insights. The business was in peril under current leadership, and my control over the shares was a leverage point we could wield carefully. Her advice was clear: move slowly and discreetly. Michael and Clara were reckless but proud, and confrontation without preparation could backfire spectacularly. Instead, I needed to build a coalition within the board of directors, marshal evidence, and prepare to assert my control at the moment when they least expected it. Returning home, I maintained a mask of composed calm. There were no hints of my gathering storm when Michael called with his usual bravado or when Clara smiled with practiced charm. To them, I was still the quietly sidelined matriarch, out of touch but polite. But beneath that surface, I was working silently, gathering allies, preparing documents, and studying every detail of the business's vulnerabilities. One of the more difficult aspects was navigating the thin line between family and business. I had to convince others without raising suspicions, speak truths without seeming confrontational, and expose mistakes without stirring chaos. Communications with board members had to be discreet but clear. I identified a few trusted voices, longtime employees and advisors who had also expressed concerns about Michael and Clara's management. Their worries, kept in hushed tones, found a safe place in my hands. Meanwhile, every day brought new challenges. Michael continued to parade his confidence, oblivious to the ground shifting beneath his feet. One afternoon, he stopped by unexpectedly, flush with excitement for a new project he was spearheading. He spoke quickly and loudly about expansion plans, new investments, and market domination, assuming I would be impressed. Instead, I listened attentively, quietly noting inconsistencies, risk factors, and overlooked details. His plans were bold but reckless, fueled more by ego than understanding. When he left, closing the door without a backward glance, I stood silently by the window and let the truth settle. His hubris was a dangerous vulnerability. I no longer felt anger but a sober responsibility to guide the business back to safe shores. With Diane's help, I refined our strategy. Legal consultations filled my days and evenings. We studied shareholder rights, veto powers, and internal governance procedures. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on me, but it was a burden I embraced willingly, knowing it was necessary for the family and the business to survive. As our plan took shape, I began assembling a comprehensive dossier not just of errors and debts but of corrective proposals. I wanted to be not just a critic but a leader able to restore balance and respect to the company's operations. The papers detailed the dangers of recent decisions and outlined clear pathways for sustainable growth, a vision that honored Henry's original dream and ensured the family's continued prosperity. While assembling this evidence, I never lost sight of the emotional landscape. This was more than a business struggle. It was a clash of identities and loyalties. Years of silence and sidelining had hidden more than my voice. They had concealed my growing strength and clarity of purpose. The pain of betrayal remained, but it had been channeled into resolve. I wasn't chasing vengeance. I was seeking restoration. Behind the scenes, I kept my routine flawless. I accepted Michael's phone calls with measured warmth, played the attentive mother-in-law with practiced ease, and greeted Clara's calculated smiles with an unshaken serenity. No one suspected that beneath this calm climbed a tide of quiet revolution. Evenings grew long with careful planning. I rehearsed presentations, prepared to lay bare the evidence and demand accountability. Diane was my steadfast ally, her experience guiding every move. We mapped out who to approach, when to push, and how to maintain control of the narrative. Each day strengthened my resolve, sharpening my focus on the moment to assert my authority. The board meetings ahead would be pivotal. I pictured the surprise on their faces when the matriarch they dismissed rose with facts in hand, owning her power not with anger but undeniable proof. The thought steadied me. The house, once heavy with whispered slights and quiet exclusions, was now the nerve center of a carefully planned resurgence. Every glance and every word became a thread in the tapestry of a new order I was weaving with patient precision. They had all underestimated me. Their silence in my presence, their dismissal of my ideas, and their assumption of my weakness were their gravest mistakes. I was ready to reclaim my place not with noise or fury, but with the steady, unyielding strength of truth. This was the dawn of my quiet authority, a rise unimaginable to those who saw only the surface. A matriarch reborn through silence into power. The time was coming soon to make them see my family, my business, and most of all, myself. And I would do so with the grace and strength that only years of quiet endurance can teach. The morning light that filtered quietly through the tall windows of the conference room seemed almost too gentle for the weight of what was to come. Years of watching from the sidelines had not prepared me for the moment I was about to claim. Still, with careful breath and steady steps, I walked into the room that held my family's legacy as well as its future. The long table stretched before me, polished and imposing, much like the faces that greeted me. They looked at me not with respect but with a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed irritation. Michael, with his usual assured posture, barely masked the surprise flashing in his eyes. Clara's smile was tight, a practiced mask of civility hiding the sharp edge beneath. Around us, board members and executives settled in, their murmurs and exchanging glances betraying their uncertainty as they gathered for what was supposed to be a routine meeting. This would not be routine. I stood with calm confidence and acknowledged the room. Thank you all for being here today. We have important decisions to make about the company's future, and I have some crucial matters to present. As I spoke, the dossier Diane and I had prepared carefully was unfolding between us, the years of overlooked mistakes, reckless expenses, and decisions made without foresight. I laid out each point quietly but unflinchingly. With every detail, I saw the sharp confidence in Michael's eyes waver, the glint of certainty in Clara's expression dull. They had acted with an arrogance born of entitlement, careless in their disregard of the company's fragile foundations. I explained the financial consequences with precision, contracts signed without thorough review, payments gone astray, and blind trust in unchecked ventures. The room grew heavy with the weight of undeniable facts. The carefully maintained facades began to crack. Then I revealed what no one expected, that I still held the majority of the company's shares. The room fell silent as the real power shifted before their eyes. My voice did not waver as I laid bare the implications: veto powers, decision-making authority, and control rooted in years of careful stewardship and unwavering loyalty to the family's vision. Their disbelief was tangible. Michael attempted to regain ground, words of ambition and future plans spilling out, but the foundation beneath him gave way. Clara's sharp replies were diminished in the face of facts. The meeting room was no longer arena but tribunal, where truth weighed more than false bravado. One by one, voices whispered in agreement. The tide in the room turned as board members began to articulate the need for responsible leadership, for a return to the thoughtful planning and respect that had once defined the family business. The coalition grew quietly but steadily. Sitting down at last, I felt the change in the air. The dismissal, the ignorance, the silent exclusion, it was melting away. The matriarch they had underestimated was no longer a shadow but the guiding force illuminating the path forward. Michael's frustration was evident but muted. Clara's eyes held reluctant respect mingled with wounded pride. The days after the meeting unfolded with a steady transformation. The reckless ambitions that had pushed the business to the edge shifted toward careful consideration and long-term vision. Decisions once made with arrogance were revisited with scrutiny and diligence. The company, like a ship righting itself after a storm, began to find a steadier course. Within our family, the echoes of change were quieter but just as profound. Dinner conversations that once carried the weight of cold silences and veiled rebukes softened. Michael's confident assertions gave way to thoughtful words, his ego tempered by an awareness he could no longer ignore. Clara's edge dulled just slightly, her calculated manner softened by the unmistakable truth of my presence. Through it all, I maintained my steady course. Reclaiming this power was not a quest for vengeance but an act of protection for my husband's legacy, for the family, for the future we all deserved. The steadily turning tide reached the company's employees. Fear and uncertainty diminished, replaced by cautious optimism. The trust Henry and I had built over decades began to be restored with quiet grace. Walking these halls, touching the furniture worn smooth by years of family moments, I felt a deep, profound peace. This journey from the sting of betrayal, through silent endurance, to the quiet reclaiming of authority was the legacy of strength I now carried. The keys left to me were more than documents. They were symbols of a promise, of a vision, of a family's future protected by solemn duty and unwavering love. Standing within these walls, I knew the family would finally see me as the matriarch I had always been: steady, quiet, and unstoppable. The legacy lived on, and so would I. The day of the decisive gathering arrived with a weight I could feel deep in my bones. Michael and Clara entered the boardroom with the confidence of heirs who believed the family business was their birthright, unchallenged and unquestionable. They strode in as though the company belonged solely to them, as though my role was an anachronism, irrelevant and outdated. But beneath my composed exterior, a quiet storm had been brewing, a tide of strength and preparation forged in years of silence and observation. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and leather, a space that had been witness to decades of decisions, triumphs, and tensions. This time, it would witness a reckoning. I took my seat with deliberate calm, meeting their gazes calmly but firmly. Michael's eyes held a spark of arrogant defiance. Clara's smile was tight and knowing, their confidence a brittle mask stretched thin by the reality they refused to face. As the attendees settled, I knew the moment demanded more than just words. It demanded undeniable truth. When my turn to speak came, I opened with the facts clear, precise, and uncompromising. I laid bare the extent of mismanagement under Michael's and Clara's leadership. Contracts hastily signed with little oversight. Deadlines missed. Budgets exceeded. Risks taken without due diligence. Each point was backed by documentation painstakingly gathered over weeks, a mirror reflecting their negligence. Michael's face flushed, and his usual swagger faltered. Clara's sharp rebuttals momentarily tried to mask their growing unease, accusing me of clinging to the past, blocking progress. But their words faltered against the strength of the evidence. Then, with quiet authority, I revealed the truth they had long ignored, that I held a majority of the company's shares. The room fell into a heavy silence as this revelation settled like a stone dropped into still water. I explained clearly what this meant: veto power, authority to safeguard the company's future, and the responsibility Henry had entrusted me with. Their disbelief was palpable. Michael's eyes narrowed, struggling with the reality that the power he believed was his by default was, in fact, firmly in my hands. Clara's poised exterior cracked for just a fraction, an expression mingling anger, surprise, and reluctant recognition. The boardroom atmosphere shifted. The arrogance and entitlement that had carried Michael and Clara began to unravel, replaced by cautious contemplation. Board members previously silent started to voice agreement. They spoke of the need for stable leadership, for respect to be paid not only to profits but to the legacy and the people who had built this company from the ground up. Michael tried to rally, defending his vision as bold and necessary. Clara echoed his defense with pointed remarks about innovation and adapting to a new era. But their bravado, stripped of reassurance, rang hollow against the weight of long-ignored consequences. I maintained my calm, letting the facts and authority I wielded speak for themselves. I reminded them that leadership was not about dominance or entitlement, but stewardship and respect, a lesson Henry had taught me well. As the meeting drew to a close, the unity in the room was tentative but unmistakable. Michael and Clara's defiance dulled under the firm reality of my position, and acceptance, though reluctant, began to seep in. In those moments, I felt the power of quiet authority settle deeply within me. The family had long seen me as a relic. Now they saw me as the matriarch who would guide, protect, and ensure the company's survival beyond transient ambitions. Walking away from the boardroom, the weight of responsibility felt less like a burden and more like a mantle I was born to bear. The reckless pursuit of power would no longer threaten the future Henry and I had dreamed of. The days that followed brought visible change. Decisions were no longer rushed acts of hubris but measured steps toward stability. Michael's once brash plans gave way to cautious strategies shaped by hard truths. Clara's sharpness softened, replaced by a quieter ambition tempered by respect for the legacy we protected. At family dinners, conversations that once crackled with unspoken tension softened into exchanges laced with newfound respect. Michael's words carried a humility previously absent. Clara's sharp tongue was tempered by the undeniable reality of my authority. Within the company, employees who had often whispered about uncertainty found renewed clarity and confidence. They saw leadership grounded not in entitlement but in responsibility and care. As I moved through the hallways, the same walls that had witnessed joy and grief I felt settled. This journey, from being overlooked to owning my place, had forged an inner strength I had long underestimated. The keys Henry entrusted to me were no longer just legal instruments. They were the symbol of a promise kept, a vow to protect family and business with steadfast dedication. Standing quietly in my home, surrounded by memories and the life we built, I knew the family finally saw me as I always was, and had always been capable of becoming. The steady, silent force that no one could ignore. The legacy is not just a thing of the past. It lives within me, steadfast and unshakable, just as I will continue to be. The days that followed carried a calm I had long sought, steady and deliberate, like the first soft breezes after a fierce storm. Michael and Clara retreated into quieter roles, their earlier confidence replaced by a tentative acceptance of the new reality. Their ambitions remained, but they learned to temper them with respect. The family business was no longer a playground dominated by arrogance but a legacy carefully guarded. At our family dinners, unspoken tensions loosened their grip. The conversation softened, filled with pauses where once there had been charged silence. Michael spoke less like the heir entitled by birth and more like a son learning to listen, his words touched now with reflection. Clara's sharp edges rounded just enough. Her ambition was still there, but cloaked with a restraint shaped by the undeniable truth of my presence. Within the company, a subtle shift unfolded. Employees who once carried the weight of uncertainty now moved with a renewed sense of purpose. Whispers of worry gave way to conversations filled with cautious hope. The culture I and Henry had nurtured over the years was beginning to breathe again, steady, resilient, alive. Walking through the familiar hall's walls steeped in laughter, tears, and long-forgotten secrets, I felt an unshakable peace. This journey from silence to strength had shaped me in ways I never fully understood until now. The endurance of countless invisible wounds had transformed into a quiet power that radiated steadily from within. The keys Henry left me were more than simply instruments of ownership. They were sacred tokens of a promise, a commitment to protect, to nurture, and to guide. With these keys in hand, I pledged myself anew to the family and the business, to a vision grounded in respect, wisdom, and enduring care. One evening, as the world outside grew still and the house wrapped itself in the soft embrace of twilight, I stood by the window overlooking the garden Henry had tended with such love. The moonlight spilled softly over the blossoms and ancient trees, casting silver shadows that danced like memories across the lawn. In that serene moment, I allowed myself to reflect on the road from silence to power. The sting of betrayal still echoed faintly, but it was no longer a wound. It was the soil where resilience was rooted. The tears shed in quiet desperation had been the wellsprings of my strength. I understood, finally, that I did not require the validation of others to know my worth. I was Evelyn Harper, matriarch, guardian, a quiet force, steady and sure. The woman who once endured invisibly had risen, not with shouts or demands, but with the unwavering certainty of one who knows her power. The journey was far from over, but the darkness that had once threatened to swallow me was now behind. With the promise of dawn ahead, I stepped away from the window, carrying within me the knowledge that silence was not surrender, it was the birthing ground of true authority. They had underestimated me once. Never again.